Good afternoon. Hello, hello. Call the room to order. That's my job. All right, thanks. Good afternoon. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Steve Slick, and on behalf of the Intelligence Studies Project, Clemens Center for National Security, and the Strauss Center for International Security and Law, welcome to our new outdoor classroom. A little breezy today, but I like the temperature at least. And today's event on the Senate's investigation into Russia's interference in our 2016 presidential election. In recognizing our co-sponsors, the Clemens Center and the Strauss Center, I also want to highlight the participation of UT's Global Disinformation Laboratory. The lab is headed by our colleague Kirill Abramov and serves as the research arm for the university's Global Internet, Media, and Disinformation Center. Before I introduce our speaker, let me explain how the event will unfold. You'll be familiar with most of this. Our distinguished guests will deliver remarks on Russia's unwelcome involvement in the 2016 election and the remarkable, and in my view quite consequential, investigation carried out over 2 years by the members and staff of the Senate Select Committee on Intelligence. Now, you'll hear the acronym SISI a great deal today, even though I'm told the committee staff are not very fond of that shorthand. Anyway, after those remarks, I have a handful of questions for our guests. Then we'll open up the floor to your questions. So, when we reach that point, just be ready with your question, raise your hand, I'll recognize you, we'll get your microphone, and off we go. Now, this is not necessarily a new topic for us, right? Some of you may recall our National Security Forum in November of 2019, when we hosted SISI Chairman Richard Burr, the Vice Chairman Mark Warner, and Texas's own member of that committee, John Cornyn, and we celebrated and encouraged the committee's bipartisan work on this important national question. But to learn more, today we're joined by Emily Harding. Emily's a fellow and a deputy director of the International Security Program at the Center for Strategic and International Studies in Washington, D.C. Before joining CSIS, Emily was the deputy staff director of the Senate Intelligence Committee and played a leading role in this investigation, as well as the preparation of its 5-volume report. Emily is a professional intelligence officer. She started her career as an analyst at the CIA. She was also a valued colleague of Will Imboden's and mine on the staff of the National Security Council, now several years ago, I confess. With that, please join me in welcoming Emily back to Austin.
Block the wind a little bit and turn this way. That feels great. And I hear everybody I've met in Austin this week has said, oh, it's so much cooler, you're so lucky. So I'm going to take that as a sign that you guys are really happy to have me here, and we all just wanted to sit outside and have a nice party on a beautiful day in Austin, Texas. I appreciate Steve's wonderful introduction. Valued colleagues, I looked up to him and Will so much when I was on the NSC, and I continue to call on them for advice and wise counsel. I'm pleased to be here. If Steve had asked me to come down and flip pancakes, I would have done it. So this is a real thrill for me. Many thanks to the Strauss Center, the Clemens Center, and the Intelligence Studies people for hosting this discussion. 2016 seems like a very long time ago. Heck, 2019 seems like a very long time ago in the before times. But in the whirlwind of the last 4 years, some of the lessons I fear have gotten lost. It sounds fantastical to say for those of us who are deeply committed to this American experiment and the democratic values our country is meant to represent. But in 2016, democracy itself was under attack. It's very easy to forget that. Our investigation over the course of 3 years uncovered a sophisticated attempt to make election, the very source of elections, be a question, to question each other and to question democracy as a whole. We've made great strides as a country since then, but we have a lot more work to do still to bolster our democracy. As Steve mentioned, I'm a professional intelligence officer, and analyst habits die very hard, so in a nod to our friends who teach these things, I will hereby give a roadmap for my briefing. First, I will say a few words about the spectacular team that was with me for this whole report. Then I'll talk about the task we faced, why the Senate Intelligence Committee was given this task, and then how we went about it. I will end up with a few key takeaways from the report, some of the things that really got lost in the media frenzy surrounding the allegations about Trump and the Russians, and then also the way ahead. Throughout this talk, you'll hear me say we and our much more than I say I. And that's because this project was the work of a truly extraordinary team. I had the privilege and honor of being part of that team. I want to be sure people get to hear this part because it's important. I had the privilege and honor of being part of that team who gave their blood, sweat, and tears to defend democracy. A small and very committed staff under the steady and determined leadership of Chairman Burr and Vice Chairman Warner did a thing that all of Washington thought was going to be impossible. We carried out a comprehensive, clear-eyed, and bipartisan investigation into Russia's attempt to undermine the 2016 election. I fervently wish that that entire team was standing up here with me today. We all came to highly value our privacy and to really hope that most folks would not figure out who we were and what we were up to. So I will not name them by name. In fact, I'm going to try to stay away from any kind of identifying details. But at some point in the future, we should have all of us standing up together and talking about the extraordinary work that went on, because this was very much a team effort. During the most challenging days of the investigation, when it seemed like we had pissed off the entirety of Washington, D.C., I recited a constant mantra that this is a legacy project. There was a collective determination amongst all of us to submit a report we can all be proud of, not just today, but in 20 years. The really great stories will wait until my colleagues are up here with me and can share in some of the fun details, but I will say one thing. Many witnesses asked us to identify which of us were Republicans and which are Democrats. They would sit down at the table and say, if you could please introduce yourselves and say which party you're representing. And we say, no, we're not going to do that. We don't play that way. But we told them they were welcome to guess at the end. They could try and figure out who was a Republican and who was a Democrat. I am very pleased to say that not one of them ever got it right. And I think that speaks to the way that we went about our jobs. For me personally, apparently if my hair was up, they guessed I was a Republican, and my hair was down, they guessed I was a Democrat. So today, I don't know, maybe I'm a Democrat. It's back, but not up, whatever. This even-handed approach and dogged determination, along with many late nights, led to 1,000 pages that we really hope make America proud. So a little bit about the task. When we started, it was very different than where we ended up. In January of 2017, the intelligence community published an ICA, Intelligence Community Assessment, assessing Russian activities and intentions in recent U.S. elections. It was a seminal piece. It was a moment in history, and it was our job as the Oversight Committee to basically check the IC's work. We wanted to get deep on the sources that they used. We wanted to read every line in intimate detail. We wanted to talk to the people who put the report together to verify that the judgments were solid, that the evidence was solid. There was no circular reporting or any other things that had dogged the intelligence community in the past. However, shortly after the ICA was published, two things happened. On January the 10th, BuzzFeed published a story that is now infamous, based on a series of poorly sourced reports from a private intelligence firm that came to be known as the Steele dossier. This led to a slew of media reports suggesting there may have been inappropriate contacts between representatives of the Russian government and the Trump campaign. If you're interested, there's a section of Volume 5 of our report that goes deep on the Steele dossier and the weakness of some of the sourcing and how that never, ever, ever should have been used or seen the light of day. The second thing that happened was that allegations began to emerge in the press that Mike Flynn had coordinated policy with the Russian ambassador before the inauguration. Again, this was a big media frenzy. The combination of those two things led to a lot of calls for us to vastly expand the scope of our report, past just the ICA and into these new allegations. So, over the next few months, we started to see indications as well that Russia had engaged in a widespread, aggressive social media campaign across platforms to try to sow divisions in American society. And I really do have to give a lot of credit to now Chairman Warner on this issue. Early on, he said, we're going to look into this, it's going to be a big deal. And we were like, propaganda's as old as time, this is not going to be a big deal. Clearly, it was a very big deal, and thanks to his leadership on that one. Also, one paragraph in the ICA led us to start digging into concerns about the security of the elections themselves. And bear with me, I'm just going to read this piece. You know, intelligence officers, they're very specific about their language, so I want to get it right. Russian intelligence accessed elements of multiple state or local electoral boards. Since early 2014, Russian intelligence has researched U.S. electoral processes and related technology and equipment. So if you read that, and then you pause, and then you read that again, you really start to understand the full horror of what the Russians were up to. They weren't just spreading propaganda around. They were attacking the instruments of conducting an election themselves. While the ICA made clear, and our work confirmed, that the systems were not involved in vote tallying, and this is very important. We drilled this home as often as we could. We had never found any evidence that actual votes were changed. This was still highly concerning. And I'll get back down to the findings in a second. But the uniting piece behind all 5 volumes of the report is Russia. How did Russia attempt to interfere in the 2016 elections? It was critical to put the emphasis on the foreign power, to go beyond the press allegations that Trump colluded with Russia. This was a multifaceted Russian campaign to undermine our faith in democracy. So why us? The Senate Intelligence Committee was established in 1976 after the excesses of Watergate and some of the spying on protesters against the Vietnam War. When I wrapped up all of my notes from the investigation and I left the committee, I carried them to the archives that the committee has, and I set them on a shelf, one of the few empty shelves that were left in the archives. And I asked my guide, I was like, is it okay if I just wander around and look for a minute? And she was like, sure, go ahead. And so I walked the aisles and looked at all of the reports and things from my predecessors. And then I got all the way to the beginning, and it's Watergate, it's FBI misbehavior, it's all the things that are lore now, and there they are, just sitting on the shelf. And you can really see the change, pre-Senate Intel existing, post-Senate Intel existing, and the better behavior that exists now that there's much more comprehensive oversight. I was proud to set my boxes down in the same room as all of these other things. Sissy also has experience with investigations of sensitive material. There have been 8 investigations in the last 20 years of varying sizes, some more partisan than others. Our investigation included highly classified material and required an understanding of how intelligence work is done. Reading intelligence products takes practice and understanding of sourcing, caveats, the limitations of collection streams, and our staff had those accesses. We understood what we were looking at. On the question of how we went about it, it was very organic. We started off as a small group of people sitting in a room and reviewing documents. And, it's a small group. So you read and you chat and you say, oh my gosh, did you see this? And what about this? And we would just have a conversation about the direction we were headed. But the task grew and the team grew. And then instead of one place to sit and read documents, we had 10 places to sit and read documents. And some more structure was needed. And we worked really hard to keep it bipartisan the entire time and be sure that we had pairs of people working on all of the issues. People gravitated towards their natural areas of interest. For me, it was a lot of the election systems. I'm a real democracy geek, and so I really wanted to get in deep on the way that voting systems work. What's this machine versus this machine? There were some assignments, but mostly it was people taking on a task because it needed to be done. There was a debate about bringing in professional investigators or former prosecutors onto the team. And there is some benefit to that. I mean, these were people who had understood things like, how to issue a subpoena or when you needed to go deeper on some documents, what kind of tricks you could use to try to get documents out of witnesses. But in the end, our role was never to uncover illegality. That was Bob Mueller's job. What our job was to look at the bigger questions, the way our counterintelligence apparatus works as a country, Russia's strategy, policy recommendations on how a presidential campaign should comport itself. Plus, bringing in outside staffers would have been very slow and very expensive. And when we started, this was going to be a 6-month project. Not so much. And also, just getting those new staffers the clearances they would need and building the trust with the intelligence community was going to be a real challenge. So we decided we were going to stick with what we had and do the best we could. There were disagreements. We were bipartisan the entire time, but that doesn't mean we didn't disagree. Those disagreements were frequently within parties just as often as they were, counter-party. But we talked them through. When we couldn't come to an agreement, we handed it to the chair and the vice chair. They had to make some very hard calls at times, but it was always with an eye towards following the facts and keeping the report bipartisan. A word on process challenges. So I mentioned Mueller and his job versus our job. It was extremely challenging to conduct our investigation at the same time as his investigation was going on. I'm not going to call it a rivalry because I know those are strong words here in Texas, but we were really concerned that we didn't want him to find anything that we didn't find. We wanted to be sure that we were uncovering everything possible. However, FBI declined to share a lot of their information, citing an ongoing investigation. We as a team agreed early on that we did not want to get in the way of actual prosecutions, that was not our goal. If we made a mistake somehow and something got leaked or there was some mistake and it was more difficult to prosecute a criminal, then we would see that as a personal failure. So we were very deferential to the FBI and to Mueller at first. But some of their objections to sharing information began to border on the ridiculous, in particular when Mueller was finished and the timelines extended into the undefined and distant future. These were ongoing investigations that seemed to be ongoing for eternity. And that did make our job much harder. In the end, our report was much more thorough and comprehensive than Mueller's, I am very proud to say. We had a much broader scope, so that's not really a knock on him. Thanks to the dogged determination of some of our team, though, we found things that his team did not. Speaking of the distance between 2016 and now, I'll tell people, I worked on the Hill, and they say, what did you do on the Hill? And I say, I worked for Senate Intel, and we did the Russia report, and they're like, oh, so you worked for Bob Mueller, what's he like? No, this is an opportunity to explain the different branches of government and why the executive branch is different than the... Whatever. Yes, I worked on the Russia report. So a couple points on the findings. I'm going to hit each volume that we did and talk about a critical point from each one. The first volume is most near and dear to my heart because I spent 18 hours a day for many months sitting and writing these things. But the real seminal moment for me with that report was a June 2017 hearing that focused on that one paragraph, the Russian scanning of state and electoral boards. FBI and DHS had seen evidence that Russian elements had scanned about 20 states for vulnerabilities. So we had our first panel with DHS and FBI. And while they were talking, the people who were going to be on the second panel were sitting off to the side and listening to their testimony. And that second panel were election professionals, along with Dr. Alex Halderman from Michigan. I'm a huge fan of his. Watching the faces of panel 2 while panel 1 was talking was amazing and said everything that you needed to know about the disconnect between these two groups of people in 2017. DHS and FBI thought that they had been in touch with the states. They were testifying completely honestly that they had reached out to people in all of the states and let them know there was a potential threat. The states, on the other hand, had no idea. The definition of contacted varied dramatically between these two groups. Then FBI and DHS in October recontacted the right people in the states to let them know what was going on, and the states were shocked. In the fall of 2017, our investigatory team, did interviews with all 20 states. Most of them were very confused. They thought that they had never been contacted by FBI, or if they had, it went to a couple people in the IT department as opposed to the people who were leading the states. Other states, with a small amount of hubris, said, don't worry about this, we got it. Our cybersecurity is great. And at the same point, we were sitting there knowing full well that it wasn't, and that we needed to be working together much better. The chairman at the time, Chairman Burr, said that he wanted our initial findings to be released by March of 2018 so that we could get out well ahead of the primaries of the 2018 election, thus many, many, many late nights. But we did get the initial findings out, and by the time we published the final report, a lot of work had been done behind the scenes to get these parties to talk to each other, and DHS really get a ton of credit in my book for building relationships, for rebuilding trust, for developing the working relationships they would need to get the states to actually take the cybersecurity choices they had to make to update their voting equipment, all of the things that we've seen play out this year. So volume 2, this was our social media volume. The main takeaway here is that Russia wasn't supporting one candidate or the other per se. What they were doing was trying to get us to fight with each other. Some men just want to watch the whole world burn. They wanted to stand on both sides of every contentious debate and yell fight and get us to scream at each other. They weren't pushing an ideology, they were pushing chaos. The companies have improved quite a bit. One real benefit to us working together was that they started to talk to each other a lot more. Now Twitter talks to Facebook whenever they see inauthentic material. I met the UT Disinfo Lab this morning. Great work. I'm super excited to see what they're going to do with this, because really digging into the data of what these bad actors are doing is what's going to provide us the answers we need to take the next steps. Volume 3 was on the policy response. This is what the Obama administration did when they were faced with this new challenge. And I have to give a lot of credit to those folks. They sat down and spent hours and hours and hours with our investigatory team and really just laid it all on the table. They were brutally honest. They were self-critical. They wanted us to have the best information possible about what they had done. They told us they felt like they were in an unprecedented situation and had a hard time understanding what was going on, how to respond in the fog of battle. They were very worried about provoking the Russians further. And it wasn't like the election could be moved. They were working to a deadline and trying to figure out who was behind all this information, who was behind all this bad behavior, and then what they could do about it. And they had to do it all before November. The main lesson there is to develop a slate of options before the crisis. They found themselves sort of casting about for things that they could do, for tailored options that would push back on the Russians, and they came up short quite a bit. Volume 4, this was our original task, which was to go and look at the intelligence community assessment and see what the tradecraft was like. And we were pleased to say at the end of it that the IC really did an excellent job under very difficult circumstances. They had a quick turnaround deadline. They were operating in a very political environment. They were dealing with highly classified material and also unclassified material. The structural challenges to writing that paper were significant, and they did an outstanding job. And then Volume 5. Volume 5 is the one that got the most attention. But in some ways, it really does reflect classic Russian influence peddling. The Russians did what a smart intelligence service would do. They looked for access points. We may never know whether the many Russian representatives reaching out to the Trump campaign were under some kind of centralized orders, or whether they just knew cultivating influence would be beneficial for both them and the Kremlin, and they went about doing it under their own behest. But the real lesson is to be skeptical. Campaigns are targets. And with the Trump campaign, you had a group of people who were reasonably new to politics and did not have a good feel for what was normal behavior and what was not. And we saw the Russians really take advantage of that. On what still needs to be done, today we do have safer elections. I fervently believe that. We saw the improvement between 2016 and 2018. We saw additional improvement between 2018 and 2020. 2020 clearly had its own series of challenges, and as soon as it became clear that was not the subject of foreign interference, I kind of said, over to you guys, I'm gonna be over here. But the coordination between DHS and the states is night and day different. The states are spending their own money and a considerable amount of federal money to try to secure their election systems. Many more have moved to paper ballots, and that's critically important. And they are putting in place cybersecurity measures at the state and local level. I think the states understand now that they are a target in a way they never would have thought that before. Another key takeaway, something I've been talking a lot about with students in the last 2 days, more critical thinking classes for middle schoolers. It is going to be vitally important that every single American citizen be on the front lines of the fight against mis and disinformation. They need to be reading with a critical eye, asking questions. What are the sources behind this material? Is it just inflammatory and seeking to get an emotional response out of me? Or is it actually a legitimate assertion? I think the US government is never going to be completely effective at identifying and stopping disinformation. I mean, I'll say we because I served for 20 years. We're big and slow, and everything has to be approved by a bunch of lawyers. So, it's just never going to be agile enough to do a really capable job. But we do need to see countries like Estonia as a model. Citizens from Boise to Boston need to be asking questions about what shows up in their Twitter feed, and we've got a lot of good partners in Europe who can help us get there. This is the most wonky thing I'm going to say today, just to warn you. We seriously need to reform FARA, the Foreign Agent Registration Act. This was originally set up in the 1930s to combat Nazi influence in Hollywood. We've evolved since then. There are huge loopholes in this law that allow people who aren't official government representatives to operate and to help those governments and then skate away on technicalities in the end. We've got to really update that one. And the last finding is really the most critical one. And I'm going to read this because it is the highly calculated words of my boss, Senator Burr. He said, one of the committee's most important and overlooked findings is that much of Russia's activities weren't related to producing a specific electoral outcome, but attempted to undermine our faith in democratic process itself. Their aim is to sow chaos, discord, and distrust. Their efforts are not limited to elections. The threat is ongoing. My hope is that this report and the committee's work will provide the American people with more insight into the threats facing our nation and the steps necessary to stop them. And that's why I'm here today, to talk about that and how we need to continue to fight that fight. When we were working very long hours, we all had certain things that kept us going. For me, it was I like democracy more than I like sleep. I would walk out past the wonderful U.S. Capitol Police folks who manned our offices 24/7, and they would be like, geez, how are you going to sleep? Like, I don't know, but I like democracy more than I like sleep. This is more important. The right to choose our leaders is how we started as a nation. We may not agree, but what we have is a system for resolving those disagreements peacefully. It's a republic if we can keep it. We get a chance at renewal with every election, and we have the right to make that decision without a foreign policy or foreign power interfering. So I want to end here with a note of thanks and a note of hope. The thanks to all those in the intelligence community who shared information with us, who chose to trust us and share with us their tremendous work. To the members who served on our committee, including Texas's own Senator Cornyn, UT Austin's own Senator Sass, and not so secret UT Austin fan, Senator Lankford. Chairman Burr, Rubio, and Warner for their exceptional leadership. All three of them had to show true courage in standing up to people in the other party and also in their own party and in really pursuing truth in everything that we did. And finally, to the really remarkable group of staff who came together to be an extraordinary team. I do wish they were here with me today. George Washington said in 1779, when he was low on soldiers and things looked dark, "Where are our men of abilities? Why do they not come forth to serve their country?" For nearly 4 years, a set of those men and women came forth to serve. Their abilities were varied, but they were united in a desire to see this republic heal and endure. Finally, a hopeful note. 2018 was far more secure than 2016. 2022, 2024 can be the most secure elections in U.S. history. I have taken my kids to vote with me ever since they were born. I have all the pictures of them with the little future voter stickers. Soon it's going to be their turn to cast a ballot and to carry the torch forward for this great and ongoing experiment that is America. My fervent hope is that they and their entire generation will vote on secure paper ballots with triple backed up offline voter registration, and that they will question every inflammatory, ridiculous tweet. But my most fervent hope is that they vote and that they carry that torch forward. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Emily. That was terrific. If everybody can hear, I'm just going to go through a short list of questions I had. Emily hasn't heard them before, I don't think. So this is a little bit of gotcha journalism, and then we'll open it up to everybody else. So you mentioned earlier how the CISI was perhaps the right oversight committee to look into this matter because of your comfort dealing with highly sensitive matters, intelligence information, that were going to be key to understanding what Russia in fact did on the ground to influence the elections. So I also know Senator Burr's often enunciated views on open hearings. He doesn't like them very much, believes the work of the Senate Oversight Committee needs to be done in confidence behind closed doors in most cases. Yeah, if you could talk for a minute about how did you reconcile this? How did the committee leaders reconcile the need to be able to work with some of the nation's most sensitive and secret material, and yet at the same time do enough of your work in public that you could generate the legitimacy that you would need to have your recommendations taken seriously?
Yeah. You're right. Chairman Burr did not like open hearings. And someday I will write an article for Foreign Affairs or something that's called The False Promise of Transparency. People like to say that if we don't know what's going on behind those closed doors, then it can't be any good. I am here to tell you that it is good. The members who are part of the Senate Intelligence Committee, and I'm assuming this happens in the House as well, have more open and substantive discussions than I have seen in any other part of Congress. And it's really because you have the freedom to not worry about the camera that's sitting there and staring at you. You don't feel the need to pontificate or take time to come up with a soundbite for C-SPAN. When it came to the report, you're right, we definitely wanted to balance the need to protect the secrets with sharing the results with the American people, because this was about the American people. This was about democracy. And the way we approached it was we picked some topics that we knew we could have a robust and educational discussion in the public. But then other things we just did not do. We also tried to use time to our advantage there. So we would do, Senator Burr and Senator Warner both said that we weren't going to have this be a kangaroo court. This was not a trial by media. We wanted to do the thoughtful, in-depth research and then present our findings. So when we had finished a big chunk of our work, that was when we would take it to the American people and do it in a way that was unclassified, safe, but that also really did have an element of education to it, especially with the social media. That was critical.
Okay, terrific. Thanks for that. Next question. You mentioned going to the archives and putting your paper records in the box on the shelf for future generations to benefit from, and walking by some of the written records from past investigations conducted in the Congress. Speaking of those, the Church Committee, for example, the Iran-Contra hearings that I remember as a young professional watching on the television. The Clements Center is all about history and applying history to modern contemporary problems. Did you all take any time or devote any effort to studying past efforts, investigation committees like this, and learn from how they handled hard problems like transparency versus secrecy, like anonymous testimony and televised testimony? Did you go back and study at all the previous efforts?
I really wish that I could say that we did, because that's the right approach. Clearly, that's the right approach, to try to study the way it's been done in the past and to learn from history. We honestly didn't have time for it. I did pull out the Iraq WMD report and reread it just to get a feel for the way they had gone about laying out the facts, the writing style, even down to the way they did citations and things. We also spoke to a lot of people who gave us advice, both solicited and un, about the way we should go about doing this. And the one thing that a lot of them said over and over again is focus on the facts. Don't editorialize, focus on the facts. So we looked at the 9/11 report as a model because it was again this highly traumatic moment in American history, and it's also a very readable report. I mean, you can sit down with that thing on an airplane and just blow through it because it's really interesting. So we wanted to be approachable the way that they were, but then also studiously fact-based, and we didn't want anybody to be able to read our work and immediately say, oh, well, here's the bias, I found it. So, yes, if we had had many more months and many more staff, I think I would have taken the time to try to look back into history and learn more. But as it were, we were in triage mode far too much.
Okay, that's terrific. It sounds like you were adapting on the fly.
Oh, yes.
Yeah.
Building the plane as we were flying it, we said a lot. Yeah.
You mentioned several times, and I agree with you, that one of the most remarkable aspects of this effort was the bipartisanship, which is a rare commodity in Washington these days. We all lament that, but for 3 years or more of this investigation, and the committee in general, under Chairman Warner and Vice Chairman Warner. Right, let me get that right. Chairman Burr and Vice Chairman Warner.
They're both the chairman at this point, so whatever.
Yeah, that's right. Anyway, they're known for their bipartisanship, and we celebrate that. And maybe even you approached at certain points nonpartisanship. What did the committee leaders do? How did they create and maintain that attitude amongst the members and staff in an incredibly polarized and partisan institution like the U.S. Congress today? That, it seems to me, is the single outstanding process aspect of all of this, was how they held together a committee that has people with some strong views, yet you achieved a consensus report.
Yeah. I mean, some days I don't know how we did it. I think we all agreed early on that maybe at some point there was going to be a divorce and that each party would have to write a chunk of this on their own, but then we didn't. In the end, with Volume 5, we were pretty unified on what we had found and what we needed to write down. I think the sticking to the facts piece really helped, because you can present the facts and then let people draw their own conclusions. And some of the senators, they did do additional views at the end to sort of add their own flavor and color to the commentary. Like any marriage, trying to keep a report like this bipartisan isn't one big thing. It's 10 little things in any given day, and it's when there was a disagreement about something or a question about something, it's asking the question and having the conversation. I also just can't say enough about the amount of trust that the members placed in Burr and Warner. I think they really trusted them to find the balance and to do the right thing, and were willing to give them the space to make it work. I don't want to call it secret sauce, because I was there, I lived through it, but it's hard to point to any one thing that really made it work. It was really more just a combination of every day the staff sitting side by side and talking to each other, and the members sitting side by side and talking to each other.
And that, of course, was the founding spirit behind the permanent Intelligence Oversight Committee. So it's
Exactly.
fascinating and impressive to see. So my last question is this. You spoke a little bit to this, but maybe we could ask you to expand. So your investigation and this talk have been about Russian interference in our presidential election, right? And subsequent elections that we're trying to prevent. My question is that too narrow a prism through which to look at this? A foreign government attempting to exercise who wins partisan elections and who takes office in the United States? Or is the right way to think about this much broader, and that would concern malign influence by governments and non-state actors on our society? Not just how we choose our leaders, but the choices we make, the policies we pursue, the way we view our government, the way we view our neighbors. Isn't that big a problem?
Yes. That's the easy one-word answer to the question. You can see this play out with the way that the U.S. government has tried to tackle this problem. After 2016, the DNI created the Election Threat Executive, and their job was to try to pull together all these streams of election threats into one place and try to organize the U.S. government. Well, so that's great, and we were really glad they were doing it, because there was a multifaceted attempt to go after the election. But when it came to the mis and disinformation, when it came to the social media abuse, that was not a starts before the election and stops after the election effort. And we on the committee made that point to them frequently. This isn't about an election. This is about attempting to rip our society apart at the seams. And that didn't stop on November the 4th. A lot of these actors carry on what they're doing year-round, regardless of an election. Maybe there's a slight uptick when it's election time, but for the most part, it's an ongoing campaign. My current organization at CSIS, we've done a lot of work on gray zone warfare, and this is the mindset that there are actions short of war, and that a lot of, our main two adversaries, the Russians and the Chinese, very much see this place short of war as an ongoing battle, and they never really stop fighting in that space. And we as a nation aren't really set up for that. And so we're going to have to try to ramp up our capabilities to engage in this future competition with these adversaries that really do seek to undermine our power in whatever way that they can. So yes.
Thank you. Yeah, but I'm going to call a quick audible and just add one to my list before we turn it over to the audience. And that's the matter of public-private partnerships. So you described the challenge of this mis and disinformation, finding it, defeating it, not believing it. And as we're often told, the overwhelming majority of the internet and America's technology networks are in the hands of private actors, not in the hands of government. So what did you all learn and what did you all do about public-private relationships, the social media companies and the government sharing information with one another, cooperating, even communicating?
We were having a conversation about this just this morning in the Disinformation Lab. It is critically important for a sharing relationship, a robust sharing relationship, to be in place. When I started on the Hill before all of this, I remember sitting down with a lobbyist from the technology companies, and the misunderstanding between what they thought the government could do and what the government thought the government could do was vast. At that point, we were talking about encryption and backdoors and that sort of thing, but the representative said, but I don't understand, this is the golden age of surveillance, you guys can get anything you want to. And I literally laughed at him, because it's just not true. Between the laws and restrictions that are in place, the First Amendment protections, also the encryption piece, the government has very little visibility, especially into what happens inside the United States. The FBI will tell you frequently that they are not allowed to find a tweet online that looks kind of suspicious and then pursue it to see if it is suspicious. That's illegal. That's First Amendment speech. They have to presume that's an American until shown otherwise. So that brings us back around to the companies. They, on the other hand, are gathering copious amounts of data the U.S. government can only dream of having on what all of these different players are up to around the world. And, there was, I think, for a long time an ethos of sorts in Silicon Valley that, we're not an American company, we're a global company. Well, okay, great, but you live here in America, and also we're trying to do some good things when it comes to finding terrorists, finding child pornographers, and yes, finding Russian spies. So trying to convince them, first of all, that the US government was not evil, and second of all, was not seeking to steal data, that we just wanted to work with them. Now they've gotten to a much stronger place where they recognize, I think, that the sharing between platforms is very important, and also the sharing between the US government and them is very important. Right now, there's a lot of debates going on about whether to regulate some of the social media companies, and in those conversations that I had with them before I left the Hill, it was very much like, look, you need to give us good ideas about how to go about doing this before we just fill the space with our bad ones, because we will. We don't understand your business the way that you do, and we need your input on how to go about doing this. So that's a very long way of saying that these two partners are going to be knit together for the future of national security. And if we build those relationships and they are strong and resilient, then we're going to be a much safer country. And if we don't, people like Russia and China, who don't operate under the same rules that we do, are going to just rip us apart.
Thanks. That's a great break. It's your turn. Who has a question? Your hand came up first, sir. Go ahead. We'll get you a microphone.
Could you say anything specific about what role, if any, the CIA and the DIA had, either as resources, participants, or reviewers prior to publication?
Of our report? Yeah. So this is where I could dive into a really wonky discussion about the difference between the executive branch and the legislative branch. But I will say this, the executive branch owns their information, they own their secrets. We were talking about this last night. There are lots of good reasons for them to share that information with the legislative branch. And as their oversight body, if they stop sharing with us, we can do things like cut off funding for their programs. So they're very interested in sharing with us. That said, even if they share it, we don't suddenly own the data. We, in addition to our pledge that we wanted to not interfere with any kind of prosecutions, we also said we didn't want anybody to die. And that sounds dramatic, but when you work in the intelligence business, it can actually be true. So we were very interested in protecting state secrets as much as humanly possible. So if I had a copy of the report here, I almost brought one, but I decided it was too heavy to carry on the plane. I could flip through it and you would see the big chunks of black in there. And some of that we did. So to be a good partner, we went through and we knew things were classified and we said this all is classified. There were other things where we said, this is marked classified, but we think at this point it needs to be in the public domain. Can you please clear it? In some cases they did, in some cases they didn't. We actually issued, a few months after Volume 5 was published, we issued a second edition that had additional removed redactions because some things had become declassified. And we wanted to be sure that we were updating our report. So yes, they reviewed it. They pulled out classified information. We were the check on that to be sure that anything they pulled out was for solid classification reasons and not for any other reasons. We had some fights. I think we're pretty happy with the way it turned out, though.
Who else do we have? I see Paul here holding in reserve. Yeah, go ahead, Paul. I'll give you mine.
So we've asked you to talk about this report and the threat to elections, but I would like to ask you to kind of broaden to the role of oversight in our badly divided political system. So while we were sort of drawing inspiration, which Steve alluded to during this kind of dark time of bipartisanship, the role that this committee was playing in trying to not be that way, but at the same time, the HIPC was as politicized as I've ever seen it and drawn into a hot political debate. How well positioned are we to have those two committees perform their vital roles going forward in this political environment?
When I left Sissy, it was in very good hands. And I knew that the people who were manning the ship were going to continue that spirit of bipartisanship. And I think it has stuck in. And it is a delicate, precious thing. The minute that somebody goes out and decides to make political hay off of something they heard in a classified briefing, you know, that's a giant problem for the health of our democracy. I don't have a lot good to say about HIPC in recent years, so I'm going to stay away from that one. I think that it's important to remember that the House and the Senate were set up to do very different things, and the Senate is supposed to take a longer view. The phrase is it's the saucer in which the tea cools. You know, they do tend to play that role. I have a lot of respect for my colleagues across the hill in HIPC and the things that they did too. It's just a different environment.
Okay, who's up? Students. Sir. Go ahead.
I am an international student from India, and I work with Government of India also, so I feel that yes, we are a proud and functional democracy, especially in terms of at least conducting it in terms of free and fair means. So which brings me to two things. A is use of technology. So in India, you know, we still have gone ahead, or we still continue to use technology in terms of electronic voting machines, and despite a lot of things and the whole issues about tampering, we still have in a way managed to maintain the faith of it. The second thing is about the role of state actors, as in actors, public-private actors, and the whole thing about disinformation, and whether government can actually ever catch up. Because the way information is being collected, like I'm sure it must be happening here also, during the campaigns, like companies would approach us and tell us that they have specific information, like they can provide specific information, like in this county, which we call it the polling area, the polling booth, which polling booth has like youth of this particular maybe religion or a particular thing, and this is you can see the contact number of them, and you can pass on a very directed specific information to them a day before the polling day. And so this sort of information, this being available with companies and with the way people react to disinformation, you think can government or agencies ever catch up, or we have to like leave it to society to evolve and learn how to react to disinformation, misinformation, and all these things?
First of all, thanks for being here and coming to study in the States for a while. Happy to have you. On the question of the voting machines, I have become a fervent believer in paper ballots, or definitely a paper record to back up whatever electronic machine you're using. Alex Halderman has really done some terrific work on this one. He ran a fake election at the Senate where staffers and members could come by and vote, and then without us seeing him do anything, he just changed all of the votes and made sure that it was George Washington against Benedict Arnold, and he made sure that Benedict Arnold won. Which clearly had not happened. So on the subject of mis and disinformation in the government. I do think the government is too slow, and the minute that, I mean, so you can see this occasionally around the world when our embassies have attempted to mix it up on social media in the countries that they're stationed. Sometimes it goes really well, sometimes it causes a massive international incident, and in order to keep it from causing an international incident or spilling classified or whatever it is, a lot of times a lot of lawyers get involved and a lot of checks on what you're about to say and approvals, and it's just necessarily slow. So I think that the public has to be the front lines. The one thing that I would point to as kind of a caveat to that, though, is DHS, CISA, CISA, those guys. They established in advance of the 2020 election the rumor control website. So whenever they heard a rumor that was out there in the world about something happening with the election, they would post it on the website, and then they would have an explanation of like, here's the rumor, here's the truth. They would give citations for everything they were doing. For more information, contact these people. You know, it was very well done and very serious, but also kind of lighthearted in the way they went about it, very approachable. That, I think, is a great model, and it's something that pretty much every government agency should be attempting to do.
Emily, can I jump in there with a question? And our guest's question about the Indian elections prompted this. What about foreign elections? Did you all do any interaction with our allies who had also suffered under Russian efforts to interfere in their elections? Or is there any kind of alliance activity in that regard? Or were you guys solely focused on what had happened in the United States in 2016?
Mm-hmm. The report was focused on what happened in the United States, but in order to really understand the Russian modus operandi, we did go overseas and talk to people. Our colleagues in Estonia, our colleagues in the UK, our colleagues in Germany, France. We talked to a lot of them about the way they went about doing this. And as I was saying to the folks this morning, we got overseas and we're like, oh my gosh, this horrible thing happened to us. And they kind of laughed at us and we're like, yeah, we've been putting up with this for a decade or better. Welcome to the club. Probably should have talked about this earlier, huh? So they are each experiencing their own model for how to go after this. In Estonia, every citizen is on the front lines and knows how to recognize disinformation. In France, they shut down conversations about the election for like 30 days or something before the actual election. Not a model that would work here. The Brits are a lot more like we are, and they're sort of trying to figure this out. But we had very good discussions about how to go about this and learning from each other. I think that, life is a team sport. Mis and disinformation is a team sport. I think we're going to have to continue to lean pretty heavily on our allies, and hopefully they can lean on us a little bit.
Sounds like a good CSIS project.
Yeah, it does.
All right, what do we got? Oh, in the far back.
Okay. I was wondering, I haven't read that much of the report, but it seems to me like what Russia was accused of doing was nothing that AIPAC hasn't been doing since 1948. And did anybody on the Hill ever think to look at AIPAC and use them as some sort of model of investigation of how to set agendas and alter elections?
It wasn't really a comparative study that we were working on. That would be outside the scope of our investigation.
Did it even occur to you to ask?
Next.
Okay. Who else? This gentleman here. Thanks.
Yeah, I was wondering from your experience working with the Russia investigation whether or not you see other potential foreign threats that are committing similar misinformation campaigns. So, for example, with China interfering in the 2015 Taiwanese presidential election by spreading misinformation about Taiwanese political officials. And so, do you see similar efforts by foreign state actors like China committing similar disinformation campaigns in the U.S. as well?
Yeah. So, again, also outside the scope of what we did for the report itself, since the scope of what the Russians were up to on social media has come to light, there has been sort of an eye-opening moment where the intelligence community and wonderful researchers like Carol are starting to look at a bigger scope of things. Are there copycats out there? Are the Chinese doing similar things? any intelligence analyst, any intelligence officer is going to be a little in awe of the way the Chinese government goes about collecting information and also moving propaganda through the system, because they're really good at it. But that just means that it's a real challenge for us as a government to try and step up and confront it. But yes, I am very worried about copycats, because this kind of activity is very cheap and it's very deniable. So it's a low cost of entry for a lot of parties who would want to mix it up.
Hi there, thanks for being here. My question is, did your report or you afterwards come up with any sort of consequence that we could levy against the Russians or any actors that aim to do this again to us in the future?
Right. Making policy against the Russians is tricky for several reasons. There's always a, well, if we use sticks in the carrot and stick spectrum, if we use sticks, then are we going to be provoking them to do more? Because a lot of the Russian mindset, and your colleagues here know this way better than I do, but a lot of the Russian mindset is offensive defense. You know, they're after us, so we have to go get after them before they get to us. And it's really hard to look at them and convince them that, like, we're really not. Like, we're really not. They blamed us for a lot of the color revolutions that happened, and you could talk Joe Blue in the face about how, no, that was actually a popular uprising. This was not the CIA trying to, cause trouble in your near abroad. But they're not going to believe it. So you're left with the question: do you attempt to push back on their bad behavior with carrots and sticks, mostly sticks, or do you just try to reassure them that it's okay? The second option has been tried many times, the famous Russia reset. I've never seen it work. The first option, real serious Russia watchers will tell you, they tend to respond best when you say, this is the behavior, specific behavior we want you to stop. This is the specific consequence that's going to happen if you do engage in that behavior. And then you have to show that you have the will to respond. And maybe it's not by, engaging in exactly the measure that you said you were going to engage in, but maybe there's something else small that happens just to demonstrate that, no, I'm serious about this deterrence. It's hard. Nobody really wants to escalate the situation. I think we'd all be much happier if we could just get along. But what they're attempting to do to really undermine democracies around the world, it can't stand.
Hi, my name is Tanya. It's been a real treat to hear from you again today. My question is about the relationship between the intelligence community and the American people. I wanted to know, after the situation in 2016, the American society is the best defense against these sort of things, but at the same time, to what extent was it an issue of election interference or voting machines versus the people themselves?
I mean, yes, and one of the really interesting things that we found as we went through this process was that it wasn't one thing that Russia tried, it was like a bunch of things that Russia tried all at the same time. I'm not sure we're ever going to really know what their plans were for the vulnerabilities they tried to discover in the election infrastructure system. All we can really do is patch and defend better. On the people piece, we did have some internal debates about what we could say, if anything, on the difference that it made. There was a great line, I think, from like a New York Times reporter where he said, in 2016, the Russians were using a fire hose. They were fire hosing us with disinformation, but they were doing it in the middle of a hurricane. So it's hard to say what difference it really made. But this is why it is so important, I think, that each individual who's scrolling Twitter is thinking about how they're contributing to that fire hose or to that hurricane, and not letting them get away with stoking the fires and making the smoke.
Over here.
I actually wanted to kind of like build off of that question, what you just mentioned, because I actually just came off a project with Professor Pope, actually, where we discussed domestic terrorism, and one of our conclusions as well, and I was thrilled to hear it reflected in your report as well, is the profound need for critical thinking skills and the profound need for social media literacy. And it seems like in reading a lot of, academia on it, is that many people who've researched this come to that same conclusion, like we need to be better at reading Twitter, we need to be better at reading Facebook, but in terms of motion, in terms of policy, in terms of leaders actually pushing something through either on the state or federal level, it seems like there's nothing going on there. So I'm kind of wondering, like, just from your experience, if there's been any response to that recommendation, what you've been seeing kind of from your perspective, that sort of thing.
Yeah. I want to give a shout out here to my wonderful colleague at CSIS, Suzanne Spalding, who's working on the Defending Democracy initiative. She and some other brave and wonderful folks are trying to tackle things like teaching civics in schools. In my mind, this is critically important, and we've sort of moved away from it. And a lot of the push to teach civics got derailed a bit by debates over how to incorporate a discussion about racism. I'm against racism. I think we definitely do need to address that in our education system, but I don't want that to derail all of the other good civics education that needs to happen too. So maybe these could be parallel tracks. Maybe we could talk about how to handle this and also teach about the Constitution and the Declaration of Independence and what it means to be a voter and what it means to be an American and the founding values of this country. There's no one right answer about that, and I think it's about the debate. What really makes us Americans is not the fact that we disagree, it's the fact that we're willing to have the debate and that we have peaceful ways to settle these disagreements. And that's what I want students to really learn. They can be mad about something somebody said, they can be insulted by something that somebody said, but that doesn't mean that you're not still going to step forward together as a nation and try to solve the problems.
Okay, last call. Does anybody have one? Yes, sir.
You mentioned you're working on gray zone capabilities,
Yeah.
and the need for improving those capabilities in the U.S. Which specific capabilities are you thinking of, and how do you think, had we had them 2016, prior to 2016, this could have been mitigated, or maybe we could have imposed costs at least?
Right. Part of the genius of gray zone capabilities is that they span geographic regions and span domains. So it's not just if we buy this new weapon system and we're set. When you talk about gray zone warfare, you're talking about things like Russian private military corporations engaging in activities all over Africa. You're talking about, some of the little green men who are in Ukraine doing their thing. For the 2016 election in gray zone, we're really talking about the mis and disinformation campaigns, the propaganda campaigns. And then also this use of non-traditional, non-state, pseudo-state actors to accomplish state goals. The Russians are really tremendous at co-opting the oligarchs who make a ton of money off of the way that the Russian government is set up, and then asking for a favor. We'll let you get away with whatever you want to in making your money, but I will ask you for a favor at some point. We saw this with the Russia report some when a lot of these actors showed up in the US and just started to curry influence, but it's much more pronounced around the world. So the things that we need to do, I'm going to go back to FARA again because this is really one of them. If you are a businessman and you're walking around the United States and you're not officially representing the Russian government, but you are lobbying people who could make decisions about our policy towards Russia, then you can kind of skate around that FARA law, but we definitely need to fix it. We've talked a lot about the mis and disinformation, so I'll leave that one there. We need to get better at that one as well. It's also, as a country, we see government and government activity, and we see war, and then we see private sector, and we see peace. And this area between those two categories is where our adversaries live. And we just haven't created the counterintelligence structures, the educational structures, the laws and regulations about how to live in that middle area. And frankly, the hardest discussion that we're going to have as a country is going to be about First Amendment rights to free speech and how to identify foreign actors peddling disinformation inside the U.S. Because that thing I said earlier where FBI can't find a suspicious tweet and go after it. Instead, they have to see sort of a pattern of activity and then go after that. I am a fervent believer in the First Amendment. When I was working with Steve at the White House, we had protesters all the time who were out front. And, I used to love going out there and walking through the protesters because, you're so passionate about something going on that you want to be here speaking your mind. And good on you for trying to engage in your society and engage your government. But at the same time, we can't say that anything anybody ever says online is okay. And there's got to be a way to get from protecting the First Amendment fervently to we're not going to allow a foreign power to try to poison our discourse. Very challenging, very challenging. He's not talking to me, it's okay.
All right, thank you very much. We're sending Emily back to Washington with a message on wind energy in Texas. Incredible potential. So that's the hidden agenda here. Anyway, Emily, thanks so much for your insights and also for your poise.
Thank you.